It's time for our next debate. Up next, it's Chloe making her debut. Chloe, what's been on your mind this week?
Well, I'm pretty fed up of the NHS. It is time to scrap the traditional NHS model. It's so bad that even Labour are finally realising that it needs to change. Until now, the NHS has seemed almost untouchable. During COVID, this became rampant. The NHS became some sort of religious cult with everyone out clapping for their NHS heroes and every business virtue signalling with "Thank you NHS" signs in their windows. But people have had enough now, and the narrative is finally starting to change. The Brits have had enough of waiting forever just to get a GP appointment. They're fed up of seeing loved ones pass away, sadly, far too early because of NHS failings. Last winter, the average wait time for an urgent ambulance call went over 90 minutes. That is more than 5 times the target time. Absolutely unacceptable. So the model needs to change. It's not working, and Labour are finally catching on. Wes Streeting went and made a visit to Australia to try and learn some lessons from the Australian model. And why wouldn't you be interested in the model of a country where, even though they spend a smaller percentage of their GDP on healthcare than us, they have a life expectancy 8 years longer than ours? So what do the Australians get so right? Well, they have a public health insurance system called Medicare. Now, Medicare don't run any of the hospitals. They have private contracts where they bring in people who are actually better at doing the jobs. And what is the best thing about this? Not only is the free healthcare much better than the UK's, but they incentivise you to switch over to even better private insurance. Yes, that's right, they give you a tax rebate if you switch to a private provider, which makes sense. Why should you pay twice for taking more pressure off the public system? So throwing more and more money into a broken NHS system simply is not going to fix the problem. It is time for change, and if Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, is serious about listening to the Australians, we may well get the change we need under Labour. I don't care which party does it, but I want to see the NHS system scrapped.
I mean, Elliot, you've done a fair bit of research on this very issue at the Taxpayers Alliance and talking about all the whackery and wokery that we spend God knows how much on in the NHS itself, appeasing people like Benjamin instead of actually, looking at patient outcomes and all the rest of it. So do you have any sense of optimism that Labour will sort of grasp the issue?
Not particularly. I think the easy solution for any government is just to hike up the stealth taxes. That's exactly what we saw under the Brown and Blair era, to hike up those stealth taxes, bring in more money and throw enough money at the NHS that you'll put a great big sticking plaster on it, and it will stem the bleeding and it will stop the issues for a very short amount of time before inevitably a Conservative government comes back in and has to mop up the inevitable issues.
Yes,
it's short-term thinking always, isn't it?
Gruesome and appropriate imagery.
It is. I mean, Benjamin, you must be delighted with the state of the NHS in Wales.
Look, first of all, under Labour, the approval of the NHS was much higher, the highest on record since it was founded. The waiting times were much lower.
What are they in Wales?
The outcomes were much better.
What are they in Wales?
Well, I'm sure you're going to tell us, so why don't you go
Well, they're higher than they are in England.
Look, the fact is that when Labour ran the NHS, it did much better.
If you throw enough money at a problem, you can temporarily solve it.
That's just incredibly patronising to say that people don't want their taxes to be used on a better healthcare system. They absolutely do, and we see that constantly in Parliament.
As Chloe touched on, the Australian healthcare system is much cheaper. It's 9% of GDP compared to 11%.
But I tell you what,
we consistently have one of the most expensive systems with some of the absolute worst outcomes, comparable to really a poor Eastern European country.
And those outcomes weren't so bad 13 years ago. The fact is that we've got such a mess in the NHS. And one of the reasons we need more money in the NHS
Benjamin.
is because of a demographic change that you can't escape. We have a significantly greater proportion of the population who are pensioners who have more healthcare problems. And frankly, I'm sick of pensioners not paying for it.
Benjamin, what's coming out of your mouth sounds like something out of PMQs, where both the parties, rather than...
pensioners did pay for the NHS, thank you very much, in paying their goddamn taxes.
The amount of taxes they paid wasn't what expected them to be pensioner for 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, because they didn't expect you to invite half the world to come to Britain.
This is what the left used to be.
To work in the NHS. Our NHS would be on its knees without migrant labour, but I don't want to interrupt Chloe.
Yeah, look, what you're doing, looking backwards, saying, oh, it's worse under the Tories, it was a bit better under Labour, it is just typical PMQ's rhetoric. Rather than actually looking for solutions and improvements and change, you're just looking for ways to slam the other party. Let's look forward, find a solution and make it better. I want to see politicians who have got backbone and are willing to take a risk, to try something innovative and different. It's gotten so bad, we've got to try something else.
Chloe has a real important point there, Emma, which is saying that the public are fed up. The public are looking at this and thinking, we're paying all of this money. Half of my taxes essentially are going out every single month.
Completely. And also,
what are we getting for
so
it?
many of us are paying double. I actually had a private appointment earlier today, and I had to pay a small fortune for it, but I'm also paying for the NHS, and there are many people who are turning to private healthcare because they don't want to wait 18 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years, or however many years it takes to get a hip operation,
So
for
as
example.
Chloe said, do you think you should get a tax rebate for that?
I think it's not a bad idea, but I think what we need is more fundamental reform, because even if Benjamin is right and it was better under Labour, it's because that they were in government so long ago that it's just gradual, exponential decline. There's just kicking the can down the road. Everybody, ask anyone in the street, everyone has had an experience, whether it's themselves or with a loved one, of how absolutely awful the NHS is. It needs radical reform, and I'm no fan of Labour, I'm no fan of Wes Streeting, but the idea of going and actually setting aside this hubris that we've got the best healthcare system in the world and actually going out and looking at who's doing it better and learning from them is absolutely the right thing to do. Do I believe that a Labour government would actually be able to execute these plans? No, I don't. But I do think that they might find it easier to have the political will to execute those plans, because it's not, the evil Tories want to privatise the NHS.
It was the last Labour governments, particularly the 2 or 3 Blair governments, who brought in the private sector into the NHS and made it more efficient, which I have no problem with, provided it's free at the point of use. And I don't think you should get a tax rebate for going private. I think you should fix the system as it is.
I agree that you should fix the system.
For example, I think it's absolutely fine that you use taxpayer money to use private services so that you can clear that backlog. That's what happened in 1997, and that's what Wes Streeting, who's the Shadow Health Secretary, has pledged to do again. And the only other thing I'd quickly say is I was in South Korea recently. No, I didn't walk there. I got a plane, but I paid £9. I got quite sick when I was there, or a bit sick, and I paid £9 to see a GP in about half an hour's notice, and I couldn't help but think that there's a big space in the market for a private sector that would have those kind of prices here.
Imagine that, £9.
It doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not the case that we can just incentivise people to go private and then completely ignore reforming the public system. I'm suggesting doing both.
Right.